last time we talked about the variance and the standard deviation. Typically we use the standard deviation just because it has the same units as our original data set. So we talked about the formulas for these ones. We're not going to use the formulas because it's easier to use our calculator. The important thing to know though from last time is that it's different formulas for the sample and for the population. So when your computer goes through, or your calculator goes through and calculates these things, it's going to give you two different answers because it has no way of knowing whether your data was a population or a sample. So you're going to do one bar stats, the same as we did for the mean and the median. And it's going to come up here, so you've got your mean, these two we don't use, and then you've got two different numbers here, depending on if it's a sample or a population. If it's a sample, you're going to use this S number here. If it's a population, you're going to use that sigma number right there. If they ask you for the variance, neither one of those numbers are the variance. Both of those are a standard deviation. You have to pick one or the other. So on a test or on the homework, if it asks you what's the standard deviation, what's the variance, you won't say one of these is a standard deviation, one is the variance. That's not the case. Both of these are standard deviation. It just depends on if you have a sample or a population. So if we go back, we're not going to do this example just yet, but we skipped these examples up here where we calculated the population standard deviation. We didn't do that because we didn't want to do it by hand, but we can come right back up to these ones that we skipped just to figure out what the standard deviation is. So in my calculator, I'm going to go over to L1, highlight it, hit clear enter, and I'm going to put those 7 numbers in, so 23, 36, 23, 25, 26, 43. Those are my 7 numbers that I put into L1. To get the standard deviation, I'm going to go to Stat, Calc, 1 bar stats, and hit enter, same as I did in 3.1 to get the mean and the median. But now I'm going to be looking here at these 2 numbers, the S and the sigma. So for this one, I've got all 7 of my employees at this small company. So since I have everybody, should I be using my S or my sigma? That's a problem. Sigma, yeah. So in our calculator, we would use the sigma and not the S. So the S is just not going to be an answer at all. So, oops, sorry. So we're not going to do that. Sigma. You round it to decimal places? Yeah. So to find the standard deviation, that's all you have to do. It saves a lot of time if you don't have to plug all those numbers into the formula to try to figure it out. So just run 1 bar stats to get your answer. And that's your standard deviation. Sometimes they might ask you for the variance, but to get the variance, what we're going to do, so if you have your variance, so something like sigma squared or S squared, we talked about that last time, it's always with the squared on top of it. If they give you the variance, you get the standard deviation, which is just sigma or S. So if you use the formula to find the variance, then all you have to do to find the standard deviation is take the square root. So in this case, you're just going to take the square root. But in this case, when you do your calculator, they kind of give us the standard deviation instead of the variance. So if they give you the standard deviation and they ask, well, what's the variance? What you're going to do in this case is we need to do the inverse operation. So kind of like the opposite of what we did previously. So instead of taking the square root, we're just going to take whatever number you have and we're going to square it. So for this example, we found the standard deviation just by using our calculator, and we know what sigma is. If they ask us what is the variance, so if they ask, variance, well, the variance is sigma squared. So what you're going to do for the variance is you're going to take this number, 11.35, and I'm actually not going to round it until the very end. So let's see, 3, 5, 6, 2. 4. So I'm going to write the whole thing out and then square it to get my answer, because if I try rounding it too early, I might get off by a digit or so. So I just write out all of the numbers just to be on the safe side so you don't miss it because of rounding. So if I write all of those numbers out, I'll do 11.35694. Square it. All right, so now that I've done that, I can round my final answer to 128.980. For my variance. So if they do ask you for the variance, all you have to do is figure out what the standard deviation is from your 1-bar stats, and then just square it, and that'll give you your variance.
For the variance, do you always do to 3 decimal places, or is it?
It should say in the directions. It'll just depend on what your data set looks like. So right below it, we have another example for a sample standard deviation. So we've got our population up here with 7 people. We took a small sample of 3 people, so that's a very, very small sample, but we can still calculate what it is. So doing this part right here. To find the sample standard deviation, we need to put all of these values into our calculator. So if we go to Stat Edit, I'm going to go up to L1, clear and enter, and put those 3 numbers in. And then once I've done that, I can go to Stat, Calc, 1-bar stats. And I've got my 2 options, my S and my sigma, so which one would I use for this one? Right, it's a sample, so I'm going to have S equals 15.822. And again, with this one, if they ask what is the variance, you're just going to take your answer that you got for the standard deviation, and you're going to square it. So in this case, it'll be S squared, 15.8. So notice on this one, we never used the sigma at all. So this 12.919, we're never going to use it for the standard deviation or the variance, because sigma is reserved just for population, and we don't have a population on this one. So never use the sigma, we're only going to use the S on this one. So if we square our answer, get 250.3. And that would be my variance on this one. Thinking back to our descriptive and our inferential statistics, usually sigma we don't know because that's a parameter, it describes the population. Usually our population is too big. In this example, it's not. It's 7 people, so it's not too bad. Your S for the sample, that's going to be different depending on what 3 numbers you select from your population. So if you did a simple random sample again, you would probably end up with a different group of 3 numbers, and then your sample standard deviation would be different. So S kind of varies depending on what your sample looks like. And S is going to be an estimate of what sigma would be. Here you can tell it's really not all that close. So the reason that it's not all that close is because our sample size is only 3. The larger your sample size, the better the estimate actually is. And we'll talk about that more in chapter 9, I believe, or 8. Increasing your sample size gets us a better approximation here. So it's supposed to be an approximation. It's not all that close for us because our sample size is only 3, and that's a really small sample size. Okay. But that's how you'll find the standard deviation and variance in your calculator.